Have you ever stood in line at a florist on February 14th, staring at a price tag for a dozen red roses that costs as much as a nice dinner for two, and wondered, how on earth did we get here? How does a biological product that is literally dying the moment it is cut, travel thousands of miles across oceans and continents, dodge snowstorms and customs inspectors, and arrive looking perfect just in time for you to save your relationship? This is Critical Path, where we explore stories and innovations about our global supply chain that connect our world to your everyday life. Today we are diving into the most high-stakes, high-speed and romantic logistical operation on the planet, the Valentine's Day flower supply chain. We are talking about an industry valued at roughly $39 billion in 2024, projected to balloon to nearly $52 billion by 2030. But unlike shipping iPhones or t-shirts, this supply chain is fighting a battle against biology itself. This is a story about freezing temperatures, geopolitical crises in the Red Sea, high-speed auctions in the Netherlands, and why that bouquet costs $90. Let us start with the geography of love. You might think your flowers are grown in a nice greenhouse, just outside of town. If you live in North America or Europe, that is almost certainly not true. The global floriculture market is defined by a massive north-south divide. We, the consumers, are mostly in the chilly North, North America, and Western Europe. But the production powerhouses? They are hugging the equator. If you are in the United States, your Valentine's Day roses almost certainly began their life in the Andes Mountains. Specifically, Colombia and Ecuador. These two countries are the twin pillars of the Western Hemisphere's floral trade, accounting for approximately 90% of all fresh-cut flowers imported into the United States. Colombia is the industrial titan here. Between January and October of 2023 alone, the Colombian flower sector generated $1.75 billion in sales. They are the heavy lifters, churning out carnations, chrysanthemums, and of course roses, supporting over 200,000 families in the process. Then you have Ecuador. Ecuador is like the artisanal coffee of the flower world. Because their farms are located at high altitudes directly on the equator, they get consistent sunlight all year round. This allows them to produce roses with massive heads and incredibly thick stems, the kind that command premium prices in luxury markets. But getting those premium roses ready for February 14th is not something you do the week before. The production cycle for an Ecuadorian rose is about 75 days. That means the Valentine cycle actually begins with pruning way back around Halloween. So while you were dressing up as a ghost, a farmer in Quito was already sweating over your Valentine's gift. Now if you're watching this from Europe, your supply chain looks different. Your roses are likely coming from the East African Rift Valley, specifically Kenya and Ethiopia. Kenya is the equator's garden for the European Union. Their flower sector is a beast, making up over 70% of the country's total horticulture export value. They have perfect conditions, high altitude, year-round sun, and geothermal energy in the Lake Naivasha region to power their greenhouses. So we have established that the flowers are thousands of miles away from the people who want to buy them. This brings us to the most stressful part of the job, the 72-hour intercontinental sprint. You have to understand, a cut flower is a ticking time bomb. From the second it is snipped off the bush, it is losing water and burning up its stored energy. It is technically dying. The job of the supply chain is to put that death on pause. This is where the cold chain comes in. Let's trace the journey of a single rose from a farm in the savannah of Bogota to a vase in Chicago. It starts on day 1. The roses are cut in the early morning. Why? Because that is when their respiration rates are lowest. They are essentially asleep. Immediately, and I mean immediately, they are hydrated and rushed to post-harvest rooms that are kept at near freezing temperatures. This is not just to keep them cool, it is to stop them from breathing too fast. If you break the cold chain here, you invite the industry's worst nightmare. Borington also has Medimus baculigis cinerea. That is the scientific name for grey mold, a fungal pathogen that will turn a beautiful rose into a fuzzy brown mess before it even reaches the airport. Once they are graded and sleeved, we move to day 3. The flowers are trucked in refrigerated vehicles to the airport, usually El Dorado in Bogotá or Mariscal Sucre in Quito. And folks, this is not a couple of vans. We are talking about a mobilization that rivals a military deployment. They are loaded onto dedicated cargo freighters. During the peak season leading up to Valentine's Day, Miami International Airport, or MIA, becomes the busiest flower port in the world. MIA processes over 1,500 tons of flowers daily during the rush. That is 91% of all floral imports into the United States. When the planes land in Miami, the clock is still ticking. The pallets are offloaded and often subjected to something called vacuum cooling. This is exactly what it sounds like. They put the pallets in a chamber and suck the air out. This evaporates moisture from the surface of the flowers, which pulls the temperature down to 34 degrees Fahrenheit in just minutes. It is basically a flash freeze for freshness, without the ice damage. But getting them on the ground is only half the battle. Now they have to clear customs. US Customs and Border Protection specialists are swarming over these shipments. They are looking for invasive pests that could wreck North American agriculture. If they find a single bug, that shipment could be rejected or fumigated, which costs time and money. Once they clear customs, they are loaded onto refrigerated long-haul trucks to be blasted across the interstate highway system to wholesalers and retailers. If everything goes perfectly, that rose cut in Bogota on Monday could be in a florist's cooler in New York by Thursday. Over in Europe, the logistics are slightly different but equally insane. The Netherlands is the neural center of the global flower trade. Even though production has moved to Africa and South America, the Dutch are still the logistics orchestrators. Have you ever heard of the Royal Flora Holland auction? It is the Wall Street of flowers. In the 2 weeks leading up to Valentine's Day 2024, 166 million roses were traded on this platform. They use a famous clock auction system. It is the reverse of what you see on eBay. The price starts high and drops until a buyer hits the button. It is a game of chicken. If you wait too long for a lower price, someone else buys the lot. If you buy too early, you overpaid. This happens in seconds, moving trolleys of flowers from sellers to buyers within hours. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, or rather, the emptiness in your wallet. Why does the price of roses go absolutely supernova in February? We know you have seen the memes. A dozen roses cost $15 in August, but suddenly it is $90 on February 14th. Is it just greedy florists price gouging you because they know you are desperate? Well, not exactly. It is what the industry calls the Rose Index, and it is a perfect storm of economics. First, you have the growers. They operate on razor-thin margins. Their costs are dominated by labor, which accounts for about 50% of production costs in Colombia, and inputs like fertilizer. When they sell the flowers, they often sell them CIF, which stands for cost, insurance, and freight. That means the grower is often paying for the initial transport. And during the peak season, air freight rates skyrocket because space on planes is limited. Everyone wants to ship at the same time. Then you have the wholesalers and importers. They take on the risk of customs rejection and the cost of those massive refrigerated warehouses. But the biggest markup happens at the retailer level, often 3.5 to 4 times the wholesale cost. Before you get angry, listen to why. It is called shrink. Florists are dealing with a product that has a shelf life of days. If they overestimate demand and buy too many red roses, those flowers are worthless on February 15th. They cannot put them back on the shelf for next month. They are compost. The florist has to make enough profit in this 1 week to cover the cost of all the flowers they throw away. Plus, they have to pay extra labor to dethorn, arrange, and wrap millions of bouquets in a 48-hour window. On top of that, the 2024 and 2025 seasons have seen some serious inflation. In Colombia, the minimum wage is set to jump by nearly 24% in 2026, a deal negotiated in late 2025. That drives up the base cost of every single stem. Fertilizer and energy prices are still high. And air freight, while better than it was during the pandemic, is not cheap. This pressure on costs is actually driving a massive technological revolution in the industry. And this is where things get really sci-fi. We are seeing a shift from air freight to sea freight. Historically, putting a cut rose on a boat for 3 weeks was a terrible idea. It would arrive dead. But remember, money motivates innovation. Sea freight is approximately 50% cheaper than air freight. And, critically, it generates roughly 90% fewer carbon emissions. That is a huge deal for European retailers who are trying to meet strict sustainability targets. So how do you keep a rose alive for 3 weeks on a boat? You put it in suspended animation. We mentioned vacuum cooling earlier, but for sea freight, they combine it with modified atmosphere packaging, or MAP. They seal the flowers in packaging, where they manipulate the gas levels, lowering the oxygen and increasing the carbon dioxide. It effectively puts the flower into a coma. It slows down its metabolism so much that it barely ages. It also stops that nasty grey mold from growing. Kenya has a goal to move 50% of its flower exports to sea freight by 2030. It sounds like a perfect solution. cheaper flowers, and a happier planet. But this is the global supply chain. Nothing is ever that simple. Just as the industry was pivoting to sea freight, geopolitics decided to throw a wrench in the gears. The crisis in the Red Sea has been a disaster for the flower trade. Attacks on shipping vessels forced carriers to divert their ships around the Cape of Good Hope at the bottom of Africa. That detour adds 10 to 14 days to the journey between East Africa and Europe. Now, even with modified atmosphere packaging, adding 2 weeks to a trip is pushing the limits of biology. A rose can sleep for a while, but it cannot sleep forever. This disruption forced many exporters to go back to air freight, spiking costs and creating a scramble for cargo space right before the holidays. It is a stark reminder of how fragile these trade routes really are. Speaking of fragility, let's talk about the environmental and ethical footprint of that bouquet. It is a topic that is becoming a gatekeeper for the industry. There is a bit of a counterintuitive fact here regarding carbon footprints. You might assume that buying a local rose in Europe in February is better for the environment than flying one in from Kenya. But that is the grown local fallacy. If you grow a rose in the Netherlands in February, you need a heated greenhouse and powerful artificial lights to mimic summer. That sucks up a huge amount of energy. In contrast, a Kenyan rose grows outdoors with natural equatorial sunlight and heat. Studies have suggested that even with the jet fuel burned to fly it to Europe, a Kenyan rose can have a carbon footprint 6 times lower than a Dutch greenhouse rose. Of course, if you buy a local flower in the summer, local wins. But in winter, the math changes. However, sustainability is not just about carbon, it is about people. This is a labor-intensive industry, and the workforce is predominantly female. There are ongoing struggles regarding fair wages and working conditions. In Kenya, specifically in the Naivasha region, there have been reports of low wages and poor representation. In 2024, workers actually threatened to stop paying union dues because they felt the unions weren't fighting hard enough for better salaries. Over in Colombia, the industry is more heavily unionized, but the tension over minimum wage hikes shows the constant balancing act between paying workers fairly and keeping the farms profitable enough to stay in business. Certifications like Fair Trade and the Kenya Flower Council Silver Label are becoming mandatory to get flowers into big European supermarkets. These labels are supposed to guarantee that the person who cut your roses was treated well, and that the farm didn't poison the local water supply. As we move toward 2030, you are going to see these green credentials become just as important as the price tag. We also have to mention the political borders these flowers cross. It is not just pests that stop flowers, it is politics. Take Brexit, for example. The UK's departure from the EU created what acts like a border tax on flowers. In 2024, the UK government started physical checks on cut flowers at border posts. This added delays, which, as we know, kills flowers, and new fees like the common user charge. It is bureaucratic friction that ultimately leads to higher prices or empty shelves for British lovers. In the US, the trade is heavily reliant on trade agreements like the Andean Trade Preference Act. The whole reason the US made it easy to import flowers from Colombia and Ecuador in the first place was to provide those countries with an economic alternative to growing coca leaves for cocaine. It was a geopolitical strategy. Grow roses, not drugs. But those trade preferences can change. If tariffs were to come back, the entire cost structure of the US flower market would collapse overnight. So what does the future look like? By 2030, the market is expected to top $51 billion. We are going to see more automation, robots grading and bunching flowers to deal with labor shortages. We are going to see a massive push for sea freight, provided the shipping lanes stay safe. And we are going to see a consumer base that demands to know exactly where their flowers came from and what the carbon cost was. The Valentine's Day rose is more than just a gesture of affection. It is a triumph of modern logistics. It is a product that defies time and distance, connecting a high-altitude farm on the equator to a snowy doorstep in less than 4 days. It embodies the tensions of our world, the clash between economic development and carbon emissions, the struggle for labor rights, and the incredible resilience of a supply chain that has to deliver perfection, or nothing at all. So the next time you pick up a dozen roses, take a second to look at the stems. Think about the cold chain, the vacuum coolers, the cargo planes, and the frantic auction clocks that made it possible. And maybe, just maybe, that $90 price tag will make a little more sense. We have a question for you to chew on in the comments. Given the environmental cost of flying flowers around the world, would you be willing to buy less perfect flowers if it meant they came by sea with a lower carbon footprint? Or is the perfection of the rose the whole point of the gift? Let us know what you think. Thanks for listening and watching. Please like and subscribe, and make sure to check out our other videos about the global supply chain.